Ladies and gentlemen, as we outlined during jury selection yesterday, this is a case that's about as straightforward as you can get. The entire incident is captured on video. Now, what we also talked about during jury selection is that you can look at video and you can have two opposing sides with polar opposite views of what happened. And that's why we're in trial today. The state has a specific point of view of what happened, and the defense counsel has a different view. So let's talk about what you're going to see on the video and what the state intends to prove at trial. The defendant, Carl Wimpey, wanted to have a casual night, had a couple of drinks with his friend Khalil Masad. Mr. Masad and a woman named Crystal Whitfoth picked up Mr. Wimpey and they decided to go to a bar called Brew House, which is on Telegraph Road in Toledo. Once they got into the bar, Ms. Whitfoth enters the bar first, and she runs into an individual named Arthur Richter, and she knows Mr. Richter. And what Ms. Whitfoth is going to tell you about Mr. Richter is that Mr. Richter was trying to make some sexual advances toward her, and she had rebuffed those advances. He wasn't very happy about that. So watch closely when she enters into the bar, when you see the video. You're going to see his initial interaction with her, and you can tell right from the start that he's not happy. Soon after she walks in, Mr. Wimpey walks in with Mr. Masad. And they're minding their own business. They're not doing anything wrong. But Mr. Richter's still upset. And it's at this point that Mr. Richter began speaking to his uncle, Daniel Vasquez, and another bartender, and loudly he starts making some comments. Got a lot of punk-ass bitches in this bar. Fuck these guys. Okay? And he's directing those comments to Mr. Wimpey and Mr. Masad. This is where the situation turns problematic for everybody involved. Rather than ignore comments from an individual spouting nonsense, Mr. Wimpey engages him. Asks, who are these punk-ass bitches? And that's when Mr. Richter and Mr. Wimpey begin a verbal confrontation. Now, as you can tell, Mr. Wimpey's a fairly large man. And what you'll see in the video is that Mr. Richter is about 5'10", probably weighs about 180 pounds, and his right arm is actually in a sling. Because Ms. Whitfoth is going to tell you that he had rotator cuff surgery about 8 days before this incident. Now, the fact that he is in that condition and he's starting a verbal confrontation with Mr. Wimpey tells you about the mindset of Mr. Richter. He's not very bright. He's actually an idiot. All right? But the fact that he's an idiot does not excuse Mr. Wimpey from culpability for his responsibility in the act that follows. So during the course of the verbal altercation, Mr. Richter decides that he's going to arm himself. And he walks over to a pool table and he grabs a pool stick. When he does that, Mr. Wimpey steps away from the bar, turns his hat backwards, and walks toward Mr. Richter's location with his arms extended doing this. Now another patron in the bar grabs Mr. Richter from behind in a bear hug. And he's trying to prevent Mr. Richter from doing something stupid. Ms. Whitfoth walks over and grabs a pool stick out of Mr. Wimpey's hand, or excuse me, Mr. Richter's hands. But Mr. Richter's not done. He is still engaging in a verbal confrontation with Mr. Wimpey. And then that's when things go haywire. Mr. Wimpey ends up grabbing Mr. Richter by the throat and throwing him to the ground. Mr. Richter is on the ground, and this is when Mr. Vasquez, Mr. Richter's uncle, tries to step in and stop things. He gets behind Mr. Wimpey, grabs him from behind in a bear hug motion. Mr. Masad grabs Mr. Vasquez, tosses him to the ground. When Mr. Vasquez gets up, Mr. Wimpey steps back, looks at Mr. Vasquez, squares up and gives him a 4-punch combination and knocks him to the ground. The fight is stopped at that point, briefly. Once that's done, Mr. Richter is still talking. And if you notice during the point when you'll see in the video where Mr. Vasquez is being punched by Mr. Wimpey, Mr. Richter actually goes and grabs another pool stick, but Ms. Whitfoth again stops him from using that pool stick and takes it out of his hands. So at this point, Mr. Wimpey steps over to the bar, takes another sip of a drink. But Mr. Richter is not finished. He grabs an empty beer bottle, and he's still taunting Mr. Wimpey. And he's stepping toward him in an aggressive manner, holding that bottle. And you're going to see Mr. Wimpey kick Mr. Richter, and the fight's on again. And now he and Mr. Masad begin fighting with Mr. Richter, and it spills over to the left side of the bar. Once again, Mr. Vasquez attempts to intervene, and he gets thrown to the ground by Mr. Masad. Mr. Wimpey ends up having Mr. Richter on the ground in a prone position. Mr. Vasquez walks toward Mr. Wimpey, and Mr. Wimpey connects a left hook to the side of his face, which knocks him to the ground. He then kicks Mr. Richter in the face. Mr. Richter gets up. Mr. Wimpey at this point decides he's going to leave the establishment with Mr. Masad. Ms. Whitfoth had already stepped out. But Mr. Wimpey's not done. He picks up an empty beer bottle and he throws it at Mr. Richter. So now Mr. Masad and Mr. Wimpey have stepped out of the bar. But Mr. Richter is still not done. As I said, Mr. Richter is an idiot. He grabs 2 empty beer bottles. He walks out of the bar. Mr. Masad, Ms. Whitfoth, and Mr. Wimpey are inside of Mr. Masad's truck. And you're going to see in the video, Mr. Richter throws 2 beer bottles and they strike the truck. Mr. Masad and Mr. Wimpey exit the vehicle and chase Mr. Richter back into the bar. Mr. Richter gets knocked to the ground. Mr. Vasquez is in the vicinity, and you're going to see in the video he stands back toward the pool table. Mr. Wimpey connects with another left hook. Mr. Vasquez goes to the ground, he loses consciousness, and he never wakes up. 4 days later, he's taken off of life support and has lost his life over a nonsensical bar fight that could have been prevented. Because in this case, you have 2 individuals that weren't man enough to walk away from each other. The man lost his life for nothing. Now, the defense is going to present a couple of different issues for you to consider. One of which is causation. Defense counsel is going to argue that there's a lot of intervening factors that come into play. One of which is Mr. Vasquez has some substances in his system. So you're going to hear from a forensic toxicologist that's going to talk about the substances that were in Mr. Vasquez's system. He had alcohol in the system. There was the presence of marijuana. There was the presence of fentanyl. There was oxycodone. Okay, there was Keppra. And he's going to explain what each of those substances are, what they do. He's also going to argue that Mr. Masad arguably contributed to Mr. Vasquez's death by throwing him to the ground. But the thing the state is going to want you to take into consideration is, look at what happens when Mr. Vasquez gets thrown to the ground by Mr. Masad versus 6 punches thrown by Mr. Wimpey that all connect with his head. There's only one thing in the video that renders him unconscious, and that's a punch from Mr. Wimpey. And the state contends that that, in and of itself, along with the other medical evidence that you're going to see, is going to be proof beyond a reasonable doubt that Mr. Wimpey was responsible for the death of Mr. Vasquez. The other issue that defense counsel is going to present is going to be the issue of intent. Whether he intended to cause the death of Mr. Vasquez. Now, the state is going to, the defendant has been charged by the state with 2 separate offenses. First of which is felonious assault. In the indictment it reads, Carl Wayne Wimpey Jr. on or about the 31st day of January 2018 in Lucas County, Ohio, did knowingly cause serious physical harm to another. Second offense, murder. Carl Wayne Wimpey Jr. on or about the 31st day of January 2018 in Lucas County, Ohio, did cause the death of another as a proximate result of committing or attempting to commit an offense of violence, felonious assault. If you notice from those 2 code sections contained in the indictment, there's 2 words that are missing. Motive and intent. The state is not indicating to you, and is not going to argue, that Mr. Wimpey was out looking for a fight. The state's not going to argue that Mr. Wimpey intended to kill Mr. Vasquez, because that's not what the state has to prove. All the state has to prove is that Mr. Wimpey caused serious physical harm to Mr. Vasquez. And you'll get definitions of what constitutes serious physical harm at the end of the trial. And that particular serious physical harm that was caused by Mr. Wimpey is what was the proximate result of Mr. Vasquez's death. So again, when you hear the words intent or motive, if that comes up, disregard it. Because that's not what the state has to prove. You don't have to prove that he was out looking to kill anybody, you just have to prove that he did it. When the state submits to you that once you've seen all the evidence, you'll find that the state's proven this case beyond a reasonable doubt.